This one is The Fatal Funeral of Uncle Ray. Old Uncle Ray, an absolute glutton, would stuff his face until he popped a button, or burst his zip, and he reached an immense size when he took to guzzling deep-fried meat pies. He wouldn't see his greed was causing him harm, pooh-poohed those friends trying to raise the alarm, until the day when his belly had spread and he could no longer get out of bed. The doctor called round, suggesting a diet. Ray just scoffed and said he wouldn't try it. His life was in danger, the doctor foresaw, yet never expected he'd fall through the floor. Large lumps of lardy cake formed his last snack. The joist gave way with a terrible crack, and Ray dropped in on his sister Sarah, who had been his most devoted carer. Of her funeral there is little to tell. A sombre occasion, but all went well. Yet his the next day was a disaster. I can't think of many that were vaster. The seeds were planted at the very start. The undertaker played a major part, for the man they chose was a black-clad creep who conducted a funeral on the cheap. On arriving, he gawped and stood aghast. He'd never set eyes on a corpse so vast. Throughout all his years he'd never seen worse. No way could he squeeze Ray into the hearse. He stood for a long time, racking his brain, finally deciding to call in a crane. He'd seen one used to remove a beach whale and had no inkling that his plan would fail. He laid the departed out in a skip. On moving, it started to swing and slip. And as the cortege drove slowly through town, 15 pedestrians were crudely mown down. 24 more fell on Cemetery Way, 24 souls to join Ray in cold clay. The undertaker rubbed his hands in glee as he thought of their funerals and of his fee. Ray's grave had to be so deep and so wide that 2 of the diggers curled up and died, while the one they left to complete the task needed to breathe through an oxygen mask. By the time Ray arrived on his graveside, 42 innocent people had died. In hindsight, it should have been a warning of what lay in store for those in mourning. The skip, when lowered, just dropped like a stone. The shock shook everyone through to the bone. The impact fractured the tectonic plate, and what happened next I can hardly relate. The ground they stood on began to grumble. The soil round the grave started to crumble. The earth rose and buckled, clouds masked the sun. Some might have been spared had they started to run. But they stood and grieved, the priest presiding, and failed to spot the graveyard subsiding, as out of the west a great crack appeared. A hole opened up. They all disappeared. Many folk perished, so it's said the day of the fatal funeral of Uncle Ray. I'm only here because I wasn't there. Though he was family, I just didn't care.